Hello. Thank you all for coming out on this foggy night in Fort Tryon Park for our program associated with Spectrum of Desire. I am Melanie Holcomb. I'm one of the curators in the Department of Medieval Art and the Cloisters, and Spectrum of Desire is a project created by me and my co-curator. Just stand up for a minute, Nancy. Nancy Tebow. So we are delighted that you are here, and I hope you are welcome to have some time with the exhibition in the half hour after this talk. But before you can see anything, you get to have a performance of sorts. I am really delighted to do this program with some very good friends who know the romance of the rose like nobody's business. You couldn't do a show about medieval desire without talking about romance of the rose. It is, as you'll learn, it's sort of the quintessential romance story for the medieval world, and what's also great about it from the art historical perspective is that it is loaded up with images, and so we of course have a manuscript of the rose on view in the galleries now. So we wanted tonight to be something different from our usual fare, and kind of get you into the rose in a number of ways. We are going to have someone read some passages for us, or perform some passages for us. Veronica Gommier is a performer, producer, visual artist, and all-around creative, based in Newark, New Jersey. She is co-founder and director of Our Way, a network of artists dedicated to the pursuit, presentation, and creation of culturally relevant art, highlighting the experiences of Black and Brown people. Veronica will be our reader as we look closely at certain passages of the rose. And then as we're going to have a discussion, a very open and I think enjoyable discussion between two great scholars of the rose. One is Eliza Zingesser, an associate professor of French and director of French graduate studies and graduate admissions at Columbia University. Her research interests include medieval French and Occitan literature, music and culture, as well as linguistics, queer theory, eco-criticism, and sound studies. She is the author of Stolen Song, How the Troubadours Became French, published by Cornell University Press in 2020, and her upcoming book project is titled Lovebirds, Avian Erotic Entanglements in Medieval French and Occitan Literature. And to deal with the image side of things, but I know both of these scholars, they're going to be moving back and forth between the two. We have Christopher T. Richards. He's currently a visiting assistant professor of art at Colby College in Maine. His research focuses on late medieval illuminated manuscripts of French poetry, through which he considers the intersection of picture theory and the history of sexuality. He has published widely on subjects in medieval artistic practice and queer theory, and collaborates with contemporary artists who aspire to tell queer and feminist histories through their artworks. I'm already excited. So we're going to begin. Veronica's going to kick us off with just a little taste of what the rose is about, and then Christopher, Eliza, and I will come back and take the stage. Okay.
In the 20th year of my life, at the time when love exacts his tribute from young people, I lay down one night, as usual, and slept very soundly. During my sleep, I saw a very beautiful and pleasing dream. Now I wish to tell this dream in rhyme, the more to make your hearts rejoice, since love both begs and commands me to do so. And if anyone asks what I wish the romance to be called, which I begin here. It is the romance of the rose, in which the whole art of love is contained.
The mics are working? Yes.
I think
That's
so.
a great start.
Yeah, I wish I never had to read it myself again. That was beautiful.
So, Eliza, I'm wondering if you can get us started here. Tell us a little bit about what the rose is, why it's important, why are we here at all?
Sure, yes. So it was an absolute medieval bestseller, top of the New York Times bestseller list. It is a very strange text in which simultaneously nothing happens and a lot happens. The plot can really be summarized in one sentence. A man has a dream, sees a rose in a garden, falls in love with it, and eventually goes on to pluck it. That's the one sentence version of the plot. But there's a lot that happens that can be elaborated upon. It's also a dual authored text, which is very important. The first section is by someone called Guillaume de Loris, and it was written around 1230. And that's the very well-behaved portion of the text. It's very decorous and uses proper language, and it's much more what you would expect of a medieval text. What happens in Guillaume's section is essentially that the lover, as you just heard, tells us he falls asleep. One night, he dreams of a beautiful garden that's enclosed in some painted walls that have negative personifications on the outside. Things like poverty and avarice are excluded from the garden. They're on the outside of the walls. And then he's led into the garden by a character named Oiseuse or Leisure through this narrow door. And then once he's inside the garden, he sees a group of lovers dancing and singing carols. Do we have the lovers dancing and singing carols?
We don't have the lovers.
Oh, okay, that got cut. Sorry.
Cut, sorry.
You can take my word for it.
But they are there.
And he also comes upon a fountain, which we're told is the same fountain where Narcissus saw his reflection. So this Narcissus story, which is originally told in Ovid's Metamorphoses. And in the water's reflection and in the crystals at the bottom of the fountain, he spies for the first time a rosebud, which will become his obsession for the rest of the poem. And everything is about trying to access that rosebud. So we're gonna say more about that episode later, but at this point he meets the god of love, who comes down and shoots him with some pointy arrows. And indoctrinates him essentially into what he should do as a good lover. And then he also meets a character called Fair Welcome, and we'll also come back to Fair Welcome, a very handsome young man. So Guillaume's Rose seems to have been left unfinished, possibly intentionally. There's some scholarship that indicates that it was probably an intentional invitation to someone to take up the baton, so to speak. And that person was Jean de Meun, who continued the rose sometime around 1275. And this handover of the text from Guillaume to Jean is actually described in the text itself in a very strange meta moment. We have this passing of the book from one author to the other. Okay, so then we get to the really weird section of the rose, which is just completely batty on so many levels. Trying to summarize Jean's portion of the rose, I realize, is a bit like trying to summarize Proust. It's basically an impossible task. Whatever happens is really not happening on the level of plot. What you get in Jean's section is a series of allegorical personifications who come and speak at great length. Some of them you wish would shut up a little bit sooner. And they behave very strangely. Reason, for example, who you would think would be reasonable, is eminently unreasonable. Not only does she demonstrate failures of logic, but she also speaks very indecorously. There's a lengthy section on whether you can call balls balls. Is it appropriate to call balls balls? Yes, that's the rose. So then we get some other characters. We get friend, old woman, and nature and genius by the end of the text. And nature and genius are all about procreative sex. Their big messages: go into the forge little human beings.
There they are.
And go have sex. Okay, so eventually we get to the ending where, with genius's blessing, the lover attacks the enclosure where the rose is, plucks the rose, and this is very clearly a euphemism for sexual consummation. We're told at great length how he sticks his pilgrim's staff into the narrow enclosure between two columns, and
It's not a subtle part of the text.
No, not at all. And that's where the text ends.
Yeah. There it is in this manuscript, the staff in the small slit with the castle on fire, and that's the end of the story.
And then he wakes up.
And then he wakes up. So let's talk to Christopher a moment. Talk to us a little bit about all the pictures that go with this text. This is because it's kind of extraordinary that this book is just so heavily illustrated and frequently illustrated.
Yes, there are over 300 surviving manuscripts of the Romance of the Rose, which is quite a lot for a medieval text, particularly a medieval secular text. And over 80% of them are illuminated with pictures. It was much more unusual to have a copy of this book without pictures. And another thing that's interesting about the text is that there is no example that's ever been discovered of two manuscripts with the exact same group of images. So there was a lot of possibility to customize your rose and make it the book you wanted it to be. The earliest manuscripts that survive are from the very late 13th century, and they usually have only a few images in them, usually in Guillaume's section. But the manuscripts were produced into the 16th century, and this is a late example from the late 14th century. It's just a beautiful copy of the rose, despite the violent imagery. And they can have any of these episodes can be illuminated. It's likely, but there's no way to demonstrate this, but throughout this poem, there's an enormous amount of reflection about art making and images. Like, the lover falls in love with the rose because he looks into the fountain of Narcissus, which is a wonderful story about images. And so artists and patrons were probably responding to that and filling these books with images themselves. And just one final thing, and I'll keep quiet. The images can have really an enormous impact on one's experience of the text. And so this is a pretty literal vision of the lover plucking the rose at the end of the text. But this is another manuscript that shows us the ending. And the rose is nowhere to be found, but the lover is kissing a bellikoi, or fair welcome, that character Eliza mentioned, and they're engaged in a kiss. And there's nothing in the text that describes this moment at all, but some patron and some artist thought that the book could end this way instead. Which would really change your experience of this story, even if the club wasn't so expertly placed.
Christopher, you have provided just the segue I was looking for. This story, which I think is sort of ostensibly about one man's obsession with a rose who is a woman, really lends itself to queer readings, and I want to. And in our exhibition, Nancy and I sort of chose two scenes in particular to kind of where you can tease that out very clearly with the images. So I'd like us to kind of move in that direction as we talk about what it means, what are the queer undercurrents of this story, where, Christopher, I know you talk about the queering of desire in this story. So, but to do that, I think it's time for another reading. So.
The God of love maintained his constant watch over me and followed me with a drawn bow. And when he saw that I had singled out the rosebud that pleased me, he immediately drew the bow up to his ear and sent the arrow through the eye and into my heart. Then a chill seized me. I fell straight away to the ground. My heart failed. For a long time, I lay there in a swoon, and when I came out of it, I was very weak. I took the arrow in my 2 hands, and I began to pull hard at it. I pulled so hard that I drew out the feathered shaft, but the barbed point was so fixed inside my heart that it could not be withdrawn. I was in great pain and anguish, but my heart drew me toward the rosebud. Love then selected another arrow. He shot me again so that the point entered my heart through my eye. No man born will ever dislodge it from there, for I tried, but the point remained within. If I had been full of desire for the rosebud before, my wish was greater now. As my woes gave me greater distress, I had an increased desire to go always toward the little rose that smelled sweeter than violets. I would have done better to go farther away, but I could not refuse what my heart commanded. After I had been there a long time, the God of love, who had shattered my heart in making it his target, made a new assault upon me. Immediately, the great anguish of my wounds began again. I swooned 3 times in a row. When I revived, I wailed and sighed, for my anguish was growing so much worse that I had no hope either of cure or relief. I would rather have been dead than alive. Then straight away, Love came toward me with quick steps and cried out, "Vassal, you are taken. There is no chance for escape or struggle. Surrender without making any resistance." I replied simply, "Sir, I surrender willingly, and I shall never defend myself against you. You may do with me what you wish. I submit myself prostrate before you." With these words, I wanted to kiss his foot, but he took me by the hand and said, "I love you very much and hold you in esteem for the way that you have replied here. I want you to do homage to me from now on. You will kiss me on my mouth." Immediately, with joined hands, I became his man. And you may understand that I grew very proud when his mouth kissed mine.
I'm giggling because, there's no need to queer the rose, is there?
Yeah, let's just go.
Heterosexuality is so queer.
Yeah, love it. So I'm going to turn to Eliza, but you guys just have at it. This is such an amazing scene, and it's in fact the scene that's on view right now. It ends with, I'm going to try to be serious here. This ends with a big kiss, with a declaration that I am your man. How are we to understand this?
Sure. So the kiss is an echo of the feudal homage ceremony, and the lover is essentially pledging his allegiance within the feudal system to the god of love, who's his overlord. But it seems pretty apparent that he's being domed by the god of love. He's being shot with pointy arrows covered in ointment, paging Freud. It doesn't take a great imagination to think about what's going on there. And I think this is typical of the baseline masochism of much medieval literature. It's just exaggerated to a very great degree here. I also wanted to point out that the object to which he is attracted, particularly in this passage, but also in the Narcissus passage, is the rosebud, not the rose. And the word that's being used in the Middle French there is bouton, which is a masculine word. And the way that personifications work in medieval French is that they take the grammatical gender. So when the thing is imagined as having a body, the sex of the body is determined by the grammatical gender of the noun. So I think it's important that it's the rosebud that he's attracted to. And in fact, when he, consistently throughout the text, when he tries to approach the object, it's a rosebud. And the only times he refers to it as a rose is when he's in a more passive state of vision. So there's that queerness too. And I'm obviously it's hard to trace the history of the slang term rosebud, but it is used today and has been for a while to refer to the anus. So it's a polyvalent, and the clitoris, so it's a polyvalent symbol.
Christopher, do you want to talk a little bit about how this is pictured, how these scenes are pictured?
Sure. So this is the manuscript from the Morgan Library that's in the exhibition right now. It's open to, it's open to this page here, and this image, which is the moment when the lover becomes love's man and they kiss, and amour, love, is also a masculine noun, and so here we have two men kissing to seal the contract, which is ostensibly between a man and a woman. And this is a very typical image of the scene. Other scenes that artists are attracted to are the scene with the arrows shot into the eyes. Love enters through the eyes in most descriptions of love in the Middle Ages, and we still talk about love at first sight. But what we don't usually say these days is that it is an act of penetration. And it was conceived in this way. When a lover sees his lady for the first time, it's the first time he penetrates her body. And these scenes are pretty typical. This is another image of the moment just before the kiss, which has, I think, a very lovely daddy love here. They both look very pleased. Artists can shift this a little bit. It's less of a kiss. It does, but the lover does seem a bit feminized with hair apparently done up. And here's another manuscript with, again, love entering through the eyes, and then the god of love locking the lover's heart. And so all of these are scenes that artists are attracted to, but they don't shy away from the intimacy and the eroticism of the moment. With this manuscript, I would be remiss not to point out the very elegant fabrics that Love is wearing, and a very high skirt so that his thighs, which are always an emblem of masculinity in courtly culture, are exposed and displayed to the lover, who is not looking at Love in the eye, but is looking down at those very juicy, beautiful, exposed legs.
Do we want to talk about farewell? Fair welcome, sorry. Do we want to talk about fair welcome a little bit? Yeah.
Sure.
Sort of continuing some of the ideas you've been discussing about the way gender works.
Yeah, so Fair Welcome is the character that the lover meets after the god of love. And ostensibly, he represents some quality of the rose, the welcoming quality of the rose. But he is a standalone man because accueil in French, as in modern and medieval French, is a masculine noun. So he is personified as a man. However, the erotic tension, let's say, between the two characters is so extreme in the text that some illuminators actually could not tolerate, seemingly, having Beraceuil slash fair welcome be a man, and they choose to illustrate him as a woman because that's the only way to make the eroticism tolerable.
Yeah, and I think that with the god of love, because there is a kind of feudal symbolism here, maybe they were a little more comfortable with it, but I don't know. But Belakoi, fair welcome, who really is a representation of the lady's consent to be wooed. Sometimes the illuminators transform him, despite his grammatical gender, into a female character. And again, this would really shift your experience of the text. The images can draw out the text queerness or really exacerbate it and put queerness there that doesn't exist. And other times, the images can work to straighten the text out a little bit. But either way, it's pretty strange from our modern perspective to think about these dynamics between a lover and a lady represented as same-sex characters.
Nice. Let's go on to talk a little bit about Narcissus, who was, in mid-January, we did a page turn. So if you came to the show before mid-January, you would have seen this image. And I think that's, yay, time for another reading.
At last I arrived at a very good spot, where I found a fountain under a fair pine. There it was that the handsome Narcissus died. Narcissus was a young man who love caught in his snares. A great lady named Echo had loved him more than anything born and was so ill-used on his account that she told him that she would die if he did not give her his love. But because of his great beauty, he was so full of pride and disdain that he did not wish to grant her his love in spite of all her tears and prayers. Her grief and anger were so great that she died without delay. But just before she died, she prayed to God and asked that hard-hearted Narcissus, whom she had found so indifferent to love, might one day be tormented and burned by a love from which he could expect no joy. Since the prayer was reasonable, God confirmed it. One day, when Narcissus was returning from hunting, he came by chance to rest at the clear, pure fountain under the fair pine. He began to drink from the fountain, and he saw his face, his nose and mouth, clear and sharp. He was struck with wonder at the face of a man beautiful beyond measure. Then Love knew how to avenge himself for the great pride and the resistance that Narcissus had directed toward him. Narcissus mused so long at the fountain that he fell in love with his own reflection and died of his love in the end.
I love this story, and I suspect many of you know it already because it's around long before the rose. Eliza, tell us, why is it here? What's it doing? What's it doing here in this part of the story, in this story at all, and in this part of the story?
Yeah, well, it's a strange decision to make Narcissus the paragon of lovers, I guess. I don't think it's a straightforward question. The story has obvious relevance to the rose in the sense that Narcissus becomes a flower in the Ovidian version, and which raises questions about the rose, right? Is the rose a human woman who has been transformed into a flower outside?
Yeah, could be.
So yeah, it's not obvious, and there are a number of really interesting rewritings of what happens in Ovid. One of which is that in Ovid, it's in the reflection of the surface of the water that Narcissus falls in love with his own image. And in the rose, it's not just the surface of the water, it's the crystals at the bottom of the fountain. And in fact, he sees the rosebud only through that reflection in the crystals of the fountain. And I think that's important because the text as a whole is really interested in the way that our desires are mediated and shaped and constructed by art objects. And this is a prime example, right? He's not seeing the rosebud with his naked eye. He's only able to see it with the assistance of this artificial construct. And the second thing I would point out is the minimization of Echo in the Roses version of the story, which is just wild. I mean, Echo is an important character in Ovid, and in the Rose she gets about a sentence. But this tracks with the overall complete lack of interest in women's desire in the Rose. The Rose is, despite allegedly being a personification, she never speaks. She seems to have no agency. She's not even able to move by herself. She's reduced to this state of a passive object.
And her consent is a man. Like,
yes, exactly. That's true. Yes, she.
Wait, what did you just say? I didn't hear what you said.
And the consent of the lady is represented by Bella Coy, the fair welcome, a male character, which doesn't seem great.
Yeah.
To use the scholarly terminology.
Do go on.
Well, I was going to say that it tracks with the general lack of interest in the text, in the desire of women, and in their status as subjects themselves.
Yeah, and if to fall in love with a woman, you become Narcissus, that says a lot about the orientations of this text. Mm-hmm. And while it's very, very rare for a manuscript to illustrate the lover looking into the fountain and seeing the rose, there are manuscripts that show this. What's much more common is not to show the lover at all, but to show Narcissus looking at his own reflection. So we, just as you were saying about the lover having a kind of disconnected experience from his perception of the woman, our experience looking into this little pool on the page is also disconnected from the lover's experience and takes us back to this all-male narcissistic perspective.
Shall we look at some more images? I know we have a great selection. Go wild,
Narcissus,
hearing you talk
sure.
about it.
I mean, Narcissus is probably the most illustrated scene in the manuscript tradition, perhaps with the exception of the frontispiece, the first image, which shows the dreamer falling asleep and seeing the rose. After that, we get lots and lots and lots of Narcissus. And so here's some more. These are just two that I really liked, and it's my show, so I get to choose. What I like about these images is that the artists seem to have picked up on the artistic focus of so much of this story. The lady is hard to find. Who is she? Do we ever get to see her? Not really. What we get instead are lots and lots of reflections on art and images. And so here, we have a Narcissus who appears to almost be picking up a portrait of himself, though it is a pool, a spring with water pouring out of it. And this image is so fun because Narcissus isn't leaning into the fountain of Narcissus. He's leaning into the image on the page itself, bending outside of it and reaching in. These are really intelligent reflections on the experience of Narcissus as looking at a made object, a work of art. The iconography or the structure of these images, how they're made, often relates to other image traditions that visualize queerness. So here's an additional image of Narcissus from a Rose manuscript. I love this one because Narcissus is able to cuddle right up and give his image a hug. Take that, Ovid. He does not drown. He gets to just relax and enjoy staring at his beloved. But this severe angle locked in the gaze of another man does seem to relate to other images from medieval manuscripts of same-sex lovers. And here's yet another example of this from the story of Orpheus, actually. And so the image tradition seems fixated on questions of art and questions of same-sex desire.
But if we go back to this, because of course this is this is from a religious manuscript, right?
Yes.
And this is an image of same-sex desire that is condemns it. Yes.
You think the demons there are the tip-off?
Cue.
Yes.
So I'm interested to have you all talk a little bit about how does this happen? How do you get away with this? Is this problematic in some way to have any of the stories that we're sort of pulling out here, or maybe in particular Narcissus, given what we know about the Middle Ages?
Sure. I mean, I think that's the brilliance of the rose, is that it's very difficult to actually pin down with any assurance what's happening in the text. Ostensibly, it's very heterosexual, right? It culminates in the plucking of the rose, which is very clearly intended to signal sexual consummation. There are also some explicit diatribes against same-sex desire and same-sex acts on the part of nature and genius later in Jean de Ma's portion. So the text has a kind of defense mechanism built into it, which is that you can point to those passages and say there's nothing queer going on here. But the ambiguity of the text is clearly intended and very productive and exploited by illustrators.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are a few things going on. I think that oftentimes for medieval churchmen, so like religious folks, queer desire was bad and could be condemned, e.g. here. But I also think that for them, all desire was pretty disruptive and pretty queer, including heterosexual desire, which is probably another reason why all desire can be represented by Narcissus. We all become captured by the image of our desire, and it is disruptive and disorienting. And so heterosexuality becomes pretty queer in the rose. And I mean, another example with Bellicois, just who's too much fun not to mention again. There's a section where Bellicois, fair welcome, the lady's consent, who is a man, is being instructed by a character how to behave more like a woman, which is very odd, and the character advises him to act like a good girl and keep her Venus chamber clean. And, you know, I don't know what a Venus chamber is. I have two guesses. But I suspect, especially since Bellicois is ostensibly male, it refers to the rear end. And so this is all of these queer desires and bodies get mixed up with just about everybody. And I don't know about you, but, well, sodomy seems pretty condemned here. I don't see that in this image of Narcissus at all. I don't see judgment here. He seems pleasant and happy, and he certainly isn't drowning.
And what about the two authors? Do you feel like there's different things going on with our two authors? Do we start with one idea and then move to some other idea? Or I've heard Eliza talk about this a little bit. I'd love to have you help us a little more think about what happens when you have one author I feel like it feels more comfortable in ambiguity to me than what happens in the second half, but maybe you all have a different take on it.
So I don't want to speculate biographically about the two authors, but I will say that I think there are good indications that Guillaume de Loris's section was left intentionally unfinished, one of which is that a lot happens at the midpoint of the text. So if he has calculated the line numbers enough to decide that important things are going to happen at the midpoint, then he knows how many lines there will be in the final version. So I think there is a gesture of opening, of invitation to a continuator, which did happen. And it's interesting, I think only one manuscript actually transmits Guillaume de Loris's section without Jean de Ma. So that was clearly not what people found interesting, at least not in isolation. Jean de Meun, I mean, he's just wild. I was just rereading Genius's speech on the subway coming up here, and
As one does.
As one does. And there's a wild passage. So Genius is a priest. He's dressed in priestly garb. There's a passage where he says that when you've attained pleasure, you'll enter the garden of the good shepherd with the pure white lamb. It's clearly a Christian allegory. But then he says, some of you will undoubtedly be thinking about that garden that I mentioned earlier in the text, and you would be wrong if you didn't think about that garden, but they're not the same. So he clearly wants you to be reading Guillaume retrospectively through his rewriting. And I think that's a very interesting kind of queer continuation, right? That the idea that you're revising, reworking, assimilating the material to your own aesthetic rather than leaving it intact.
Yeah, and I'll just say quickly as an aside that that's one of the reasons why I love the image tradition so much. In addition to Jean de Meun's continuation of Guillaume de Lorey's, there's several other continuations of the poem, and scribes add lines that aren't in there all the time, and
entire passages.
Long passages sometimes. And so this was a text that just seemed to encourage participation and transformation. And the images do that too. So in our reading of Narcissus, this is a really unusual image. We actually have the metamorphosis into the flower happening here. An element of the story that the rose does not describe, and that does not happen in this text, but an artist puts it back in, and again, that transforms the experience of this very, very metamorphic poem, which is hard to pin down. There are elements of Guillaume that seem so queer, but the same could be said of Jean de Meun.
Mm-hmm. Can we talk a little bit about the afterlife of this of this story? It's somewhat known. I don't know. Do people? I feel like I've been a medievalist since I was born. I feel like I've always known this story. But can we talk a little bit about how the story kind of has continued on in the post-medieval world?
Well, I don't know about the post-medieval world. Maybe Christopher can speak to the post-medieval world. But in the
Freud does have a lot to say about Narcissus.
Sure, for Narcissus, definitely. In the medieval world, it became the text. Almost everything that's written about love or has an erotic component after the rose is responding to it in some way. It just becomes the point of reference for all erotic discourse after that point. It also sparks a very important literary quarrel called the Quarrel of the Rose, in which Christine de Pizan participated. She accused it of being misogynistic and encouraging violence against women, encouraging rape, and that's a very justified reading of the text.
Cue Christopher. He's going to take us somewhere else altogether.
I don't know how many modern responses to the rose itself there are. It's a text it's the most important text that nobody reads, as one of my graduate professors said to me.
Can I just say that's really unjustified? It's so much fun.
It's much fun.
It's not actually that long. It gets a bad reputation. It's very manageable, much shorter than the Canterbury Tales.
And there's so much more. I mean, there's a lot of medieval English people in here. But there are some modern responses to it. The Pre-Raphaelites, there's several painted versions of the rose. William Morris does responses to the rose. But my favorite, and again, I get to show what I want. My favorite response to the rose is a bit of queer cinema, which is Pink Narcissus in 1971. I can't prove that the filmmaker James Bigood read The Rose, but there's a lot of really interesting adaptations of medieval aesthetics into camp aesthetics in this film. I don't know if anyone has seen this film in the audience. Yes? Oh, amazing. This is a really, really interesting film that was made in this photographer's apartment on a very, very low budget over several years, and it focuses on a young sex worker, our friend Narcissus. And the entire film, which doesn't have much of a storyline, just orbits around his fantasies and his erotic desires. And it's done in this amazing campy aesthetic. And I just wanted to show one of my favorite stills from the film, which has the young Narcissus dreaming, holding the disco ball as mirror. And there's a lot in common with the image tradition of the Middle Ages, a similar interest in highly chromatic, beautiful, gaudy color. Of course, the interest in reflections, glisten, and mirrors, an interest in a distorted, kinky or kinked body that breaks a normative vision of like a realistic space, and just so much interest really in a sense of flatness and pattern and design over any sense of reality. Both of these images do such a good job of transporting us to the world of the mind and of love, rather than what the inner eye is wanting, rather than what the outer eye sees. And I think that this is one of the most extraordinary modern reflections on the aesthetics and the discourses we've been talking about tonight.
This is great. I think this is the perfect moment to open the floor for any questions that you all might have for our readers, scholars, students of the Rose. And there's already one hand held high. Yes.
And I do hope some of you will read it. It's really fun. It's long, but it's worth it.
Agreed.
Definitely.
Hi, thank you so much for such a fascinating talk. So I should disclose that I'm coming at this with something similar to what Christopher said. So I worked on the queer reception of the early 20th century, so 1910s silent cinema, right? And one of the things that I see a lot is this: how do we go about this discourse of looking at something that was produced many decades, centuries before our eyes and our working terms for talking about desire have been created? So I think about, how do we go about identifying these motifs of desire that are very before we use our terms today, right? So like queer, for example, is a term for describing these kinds of attachments. The other thing I'm thinking about is that the courtly language, and how did it create a space to talking about same-sex attachments that to us seem very erotic or very queer, but at the time were considered normative, that kind of attachment between two men or two women, that kind of exaggerative courtly language. If sometimes in reading that way, we're reading with our quote-unquote modern eyes, and how do we resolve that tension? And in part why I'm asking is because in the 1910s, I have girls in love with female film stars using courtly language and even drawing themselves in this kind of aesthetics to make sense of why they're so attached and experiencing these such passionate feelings for someone of their same sex. And so I wonder if it is like a convention that it continues, and I'm just thinking of the complications of that. And last but not least, I'm just wondering if some of these manuscripts that you mentioned, they were customizable, if you trace provenance. So I was thinking that Jean Montbaton, I believe, was there as being someone that was part of creating these queer illustrations. And I'm wondering if I know that you worked with her husband in the workshop, but if some of the images
Maybe not, actually.
Maybe not?
Yeah.
Maybe not. New research.
Yeah.
It's probably Jean doing almost everything.
Okay, wonderful. Even more interesting to talk about if you have a woman creating these illustrations, if the queerness or the complicated spectrum of eroticism comes out more. So, long question, but thank you.
Do you have the
Yeah, I could address the anachronism question a little bit. I try to avoid using labels as much as possible because they raise these problems that you're pointing to. But I will say that the rose clearly wants you to go there. There are numerous passages where, you genius, take up your stylus, write on the tablets, plow, plow.
Plow.
So you're clearly being invited to read allegorically in a sexual way. The labels you come up with as a result of that process can be problematic, but you're still nevertheless clearly being encouraged to do what I would call a queer reading, I think. And I think most scholars of the rose would agree with that. I do, when I teach this text, we begin in antiquity with Greco-Roman conceptions of same-sex desire and the idea of a penetrator and a penetrated being the predominant model. And I think that continues into the French Middle Ages. So what I try to do when I teach is to not offer a single prism. I try to offer multiple prisms, which can illuminate the text differently.
Can I add one thing to that?
Of course.
Yeah, I think that something that's really important with to emphasizing queer studies is that we use anachronistic labels to describe things all the time. The most obvious one being medieval. Medieval people didn't know that they were medieval, and we don't really have a problem doing that. One of the great things about the word queer also is that it doesn't refer to an identity category. It refers to a position relative to a norm. And so one of the reasons I've not said, Bellacoy is really gay, though, I mean, is because, this is a male personification of a female subject that is kissing a man, but can sometimes be illustrated as a woman. To say that this text isn't queering something is to fail to describe it. And we have this wonderfully flexible word to do the job without labeling anyone as gay, straight, or whatever you might need to do. And so it's a useful little word.
another question? Right.
To bounce off of queerness, one of you said something about heterosexuality being queer, especially in a Christian religious context, which is absolutely true. St. Paul, who is known for being very homophobic, he kind of isn't, because he doesn't want anyone to have sex. He basically says, why are you concerned with having sex? Control yourself. Jesus is coming now. So if you can't control yourself, get married. So basically, ace is the only thing that isn't queer in that kind of context. But thinking about the kind of cross-dressing or transgender issue with the allegorical figure, if that allegorical figure is keeping the rose in this castle and is male and is owning that rose in a sense, and then representing the rose in her dress. Talk.
Could you repeat the question part, please? Sorry. Oh.
Yeah, I mean, to follow up on the queerness of heterosexuality, we have an amazing scholar of sodomy in the audience, and one of the things he has showed is the capaciousness of the term sodomy, and often it refers to any non-procreative sex act, including heterosexual sex acts. So yes, the dichotomy is not one between same-sex versus heterosexual.
And I'll just say one final little thing, because the question of labels came up. As you mentioned, there's a whole passage in this text where one of the characters debates how we should label things. And so one way with the rose that you can find a way to talk about queerness is to read The Rose. And it's like a character says, should we really be able to call balls balls? What if we called them holy relics? The text and the images invite us to ask questions about this. And so I think, as in everything, we have the language that we've been given, and we can discuss its limitations, and that can be part of the fun. And the images seem to test the limitations of the language a lot, too.
You said a few of the pictures had been tweaked a bit to make them more respectable, and that a lot of the pictures are narcissus. I know in more modern settings, you could use things like Ovid to discuss things that were otherwise not reasonable to discuss because it was old enough to be respectable. Was that done in the Middle Ages as well?
Yeah, I think so. I think that Ovid was one of the, especially in the French Middle Ages, one of the ways that same-sex desire could be discussed very often. The poem that I work on most often is 14th century French adaptation of Ovid's Metamorphoses. And it is also filled with allegories. And so we have a medieval poet there going through all of these myths of same-sex desire and then actually commenting on them and telling us what they mean. And so we have a lot of evidence that, especially since Marilyn Desmond is in the audience, frequently these moments where same-sex sexuality occur in the poem, that's a moment for a discussion of how we form knowledge in the first place, because it is scandalizing, it's queer, it's maybe against a norm, and so it becomes an opportunity to talk about cultural difference and difference in terms of history and how norms are made. And I should also say, sometimes this very same poet seems to have no problem at all with it, and so there's a lot of contradictions, and there's a lot of places where we seem to see same-sex desire celebrated. Before I forget also, because it was a question, most of the manuscripts I've shown have some kind of very elite provenance. Most of them are royal productions, and many of them were made by women artists, and many of them had women patrons. So we have a lot of evidence of women reading and interacting with this text as artists and as readers.
So I think we end right there. I want to remind you that the show is open until 7:30 tonight, and I want to thank our discussants and our marvelous reader who brought the text to life. And thank you all for coming.